few years ago, when I was in college, I was trying to become a Marine Corps officer. In order to get selected for the program, you had to be in very good shape. At the time, I also worked at a restaurant and would get off work at 2 a.m. In order to stay in shape, I would typically get off work. I was only a couple of blocks from my apartment, and I would run to my gym 2 miles away, work out and run back. But I also lived in a very bad area. At the time, I also had a very belligerent attitude and would run through the ghetto intentionally. Occasionally, police would pull up next to me and tell me that I shouldn't be in the neighborhood and definitely not this late. I would usually respond with, I'd rather get shot than let people keep me from doing something. Anyway, so one night, I'm jogging home from the gym around 3:30 a.m. A really shitty van starts driving next to me, so I move off the sidewalk and closer to this shitty graveyard that borders the road. After I move though, the van stops and 3 men get out of the van and start running toward me. Well, terrified, I sprint into this graveyard. Now, this graveyard is in terrible shape and overgrown. It's also in Louisiana, so the graves are all above ground and some are even broken, and you can see the coffins inside. It's also extremely dark in the graveyard, and there are no lights. I sprint behind a large grave that's near a tree line and peek out to see if they're still there. And not only are they still there, but they have their cell phones out and are actively searching for me. Well, seeing this, I move into the trees and keep walking. Luckily for me, the trees are at the end of a highway, and I call my roommate to come and pick me up. It's a shitty and unresolved ending, I know, but it's probably the most scared that I have ever been. So, a couple of years back, I think this was an ongoing thing from when I was about 15 to 16. A few years prior, I had gotten a new neighbor. She was an older lady, like much of my neighborhood considering that I lived with my grandma in a 50-plus community. She was very sweet at first. She also had the cutest dog ever. It was a sweet little 3-legged chihuahua who was friends with my dog. But that's not what you're here to listen to, I'm sure. Once I got into high school, she started to get a bit crazy. At first it started out kind of tame. I was accused of stealing from her house, and I could understand the accusation, really. I mean, I was the only teenager around, and don't see many old people breaking into houses. The accusations were very odd though, because she accused me of stealing dog treats and incense from her. And the accusations got more and more absurd as time went on, with the last accusation being that I broke into a house and moved her furniture a little bit. And this was the start of things actually getting scary. One day, while I was out pulling weeds out of the garden, she sees me from her front door and comes out. She starts screaming and cursing at me, threatening to call the cops on me to stop going into her house, which I had never once been in, even before when I was friends with the previous tenants. Well, she went on to say that if the police wouldn't do anything, that she would take care of me herself. At the time, I figured that she was just threatening to sue me because I think like a rational person. My neighbor from across the street was a family friend. She called my dad telling him about having to call the cops on our crazy neighbor because she heard her screaming for me from inside of her house. She had walked out to see what was going on, just to see this crazy woman stalking around outside of my house with a giant kitchen knife. She had apparently thought that I was home alone at the time. Well, she ended up being held for 72 hours under a psych evaluation, but was deemed fine. Once she came back, I wasn't allowed to be home alone anymore. And not long after she came home though, she decided to be very nice and apologized to me while my dad was with me. It didn't last long though, because about a month later, the same old accusation started up again. I think she learned not to look for me with a knife again though, because she would just call me a bitch or a cunt whenever we were outside at the time. And if I was outside on my own, she would watch me from her windows. She even growled at me a couple of times. Eventually, she was taken for another 72-hour psych evaluation for something that I wasn't told about. And she wasn't allowed to come back to the neighborhood. Well, for now, at least. This story takes place when I was 8. I was a complete tomboy as a child, and was frequently mistaken for a boy, particularly because I go by the name Sam. I always wore ratty t-shirts, jeans, and a baseball cap, so unless people saw my face or my ponytail, they usually didn't realize I was a girl. I had no sense of self-preservation whatsoever back then, and used to go clambering all through a scrapyard that was a part of the farm at the back of our house. It was pretty cool because most of the stuff had been there for ages and had plant life growing on it, and some of the stacks of cars were 7 or 8 high, so you could get a great view of the surrounding area from on top, and turn some of the less rusted ones into a bit of a high-hide. My older brother kept his smokes, lads mags, and a bit of weed in one of them, all of which interested me to various amounts when I discovered them as an 8-year-old, particularly when he got too big to climb up without risking the whole thing coming down, and so they basically became mine. My prized possession, though, was his BB rifle and the tin of lead BBs he kept there. The range was shite on the ground, but with a bit of height behind it, you could take out the windows, or what was left of them on some of the old farm equipment opposite the stack. One afternoon, I was doing this, smoking away, when the guy who owned the farm scrapyard came out and caught me. I wasn't exactly being subtle, but we'd lived there for about 6 years at the time, and not once had I seen him there. Initially, he just effed and blinded at me to get out and get lost. But once I actually did start to cooperate, get out of the car and begin climbing down the stack, his tone changed. Suddenly, he was going to take me into his office while he called the police. I couldn't tell why at the time, but something about his tone really raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I think it was mostly because my brother had spent most of my early life telling me that the father was a cannibal and grew cocaine for the local cartel there. For context of just how gullible I was, we were in northern England. But I just couldn't square the idea of this guy calling the cops on me. So I froze about 12 feet above the ground. He shouted more at first, then got really sweet, which somehow scared me even more. He started calling me darling and said that I wouldn't be in trouble. In fact, I could have an ice cream in the office if I wanted to. The way his face changed when I started climbing back up still haunts me to this day. He kicked against the cars lower down, and for a minute, I was worried the whole stack would come down. Then he sort of grabbed onto the roof of one car and shook it a bit, as if he was testing whether or not it was steady enough for him to climb. I never found out what he decided though, because at that moment there was a massive crash of glass and a car alarm went off. Both of us looked into the direction it came from, and I could see my brother standing by the smashed window of some shitty old BMW, flicking the V's at this farmer. He lashed another rock at the car and took off, with the farmer in pursuit. Well, I took my chance and legged it back home, then shut myself in my room and cried, now presuming my brother was dead. Luckily for him, and possibly me too, he has smackhead speed, and he got back to the house about an hour later, looking a little bit haunted. But he cooked us some chicken Kievs and made jokes until I'd calmed down. When my dad got back, I think he sensed something was up, but didn't press it. Then, a bit later, the police turned up at the house. My brother looked like a dead man walking, but one of them just took him and my dad into the living room to talk, while the other stayed in the room with me. I mostly ignored her, because snitches get stitches, but she teased a few details from me about what had happened between me and the farmer. About 15 minutes later, they were leaving, and it was about the most amicable I've ever seen my dad be with a cop. He just hugged my brother once the door closed and got him a beer, telling him to go to his room. Once he was gone, I got the bollocking of my life about how dangerous it was to trespass, how damaging other people's property was unacceptable, and how I'd be working in his garage from now on. He's a mechanic, until the summer holidays were over. I quite clearly remember whining and being a full-on ungrateful brat by asking why my brother got away with doing worse, in my eyes, but obviously to no effect. I was banned from the scrapyard, as you'd expect, not that I was in a hurry to go back anyway. I never mentioned everything to my dad until a couple of years ago. I'm now in my mid-20s. It was a part of a larger, more difficult conversation between us relating to another story that's possibly a bit dark for this place. But when I brought it up, he actually started shaking. But even more surprising for me was he wasn't angry. I thought I'd exaggerated the whole episode in my head, and the farmer was probably some poor dude trying to deal with me being a destructive little shit on his property. But what he said confirmed what I'd begun to wonder about. The farmer in question was actually a suspected sex offender, but only by word of mouth. It was rumoured among the locals, including my brother and the police who'd come around, but he never got convicted until his daughter spoke out a few years back. And the reason my dad forced me to work in that garage was basically to keep me away from there while he looked for a new house. I'll start with some background information. I'm almost 20 years old, but I've lived on my own for quite a while now, due to university. From Detroit, my hometown, to Chicago, and currently Santa Cruz, California, I've had my fair share of experiences, both good and bad. This particular occurrence stands out because it started out innocent enough to be considered something positive. Namely, I moved to Santa Cruz, California a little less than a month ago to start my course of marine biology come second semester. I'm generally outgoing, so moving in alone wasn't much of an issue for me, as I tend to make friends pretty fast. And that was the case this time as well. And that's when I met Martin. He approached me for a chat while I was taking a night stroll around my new neighborhood, and was pretty polite about it. He was dressed well, only 3 years older than me, and pretty darn good looking. We hit it off instantly, and what started out as a one-night stand turned out to be somewhat more as we began seeing each other. There was nothing alarming about him, except for his friends and the fact that he wasn't really open to talking about himself. I shrugged most of it off and just lived in the moment, mostly because he told me he was studying literature and that was my previous major that I gave up on. In other words, we had things in common. But then, he began to act a bit differently, and so did his friends. The more time I spent with Martin and his friends, the more open they seemed to be around me, in a bad way. His friends would hit on me openly, even in front of him, and he wouldn't even bat an eyelid. I mean, some even went as far as saying that they'd totally do me if it wasn't for their friend. And not only that, but I began to notice that they know little to nothing about Santa Cruz, which was weird, considering that they're supposed to be from here. I tried talking to Martin about it, but he religiously avoided the topic, so I began to worry. Quite a bit, in fact, and apparently with good reasons as well. As mentioned earlier, I live alone. Ever since the first time, we've been hanging out with Martin at my place, and this time was no different. We did what we did, and Martin told me that he was tired and that he'd like to take a nap before we watch a movie. Not minding it, I told him okay, and went to prepare something to eat. But as soon as I began making myself something to eat, I noticed his phone flashing and vibrating on the counter. Now, I respect people's privacy, and 9 out of 10 times I wouldn't bat an eye. But every red flag ran through my head, and I wanted to check it out. His phone is fingerprint locked, and I don't know his manual password, so there was only so much I could catch. But it was enough though. My heart nearly stopped when I saw a Facebook notification pop up. He told me that he doesn't use Facebook, and not only that, but his name wasn't Martin. The message was from one of his friends, who I can assume also used fake names, and it read something along the lines of, "How long are you going to wait? Just bring her. We're going back home tomorrow." Thankfully, I moved away from the phone in time, while thinking of the best course of action, because literally, not more than 20 seconds passed before Martin came down and asked me what I was cooking, casually. Not wanting to cause a commotion, I tried my best to act normal, but he must have noticed something because as soon as he picked up the phone, he suggested we go out with his friends again, which I instantly rejected and told him that I wanted to spend more time with him, alone. Now, he isn't stupid, obviously. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to get away with lying about his whole identity for so long. I can only assume that he'd noticed, and decided to take as much advantage of the situation as possible while he could. Plus, he knew I couldn't have called the cops yet because both my phones were upstairs and I couldn't unlock his. Ultimately, I wasn't able to do anything before he left, and even though I probably saved myself from a disaster, he outsmarted me in every possible way. He practically got to spend his last night of his vacation at my place without having to fear me calling the cops while he did his thing. And I later confirmed that he and his friends were on a vacation here in SC, and technically didn't do anything but fake their names. All I can say is that I'm glad that I never went to meet his friends that night.